All right, so I want to dive a little bit deeper into the 1619 project, and there's a really great interview with Nicole Hannah-Jones that talks about the foundations of this project, the importance, and also talks about a lot of the criticism as well. So, play this video.
In a special new issue, the New York Times Magazine is launching a series called the 1619 Project. It marks the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia. The series examines the ways the legacy of slavery continues to shape this country. The Times says the project aims to reframe American history and place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The journalist behind the project is New York Times Magazine domestic correspondent Nicole Hannah-Jones. Nicole, good morning. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Can you tell us about the genesis of this project? Where did you come up with the idea?
Sure. So I've been thinking about the year 1619 since I was in high school,
Yeah.
and I came across that date in a book called Before the Mayflower. And I just was struck by how people of African descent had been here that long, and I never knew that date and never heard about it.
Right.
So as the anniversary was approaching the 400th year, I thought that this was a time to actually assess what has that legacy been, and to bring this year, 1619, to most American households where it was probably going to pass without them knowing about
You
it.
say 1619 is as important as 1776.
Yes. Our decision to buy that first group of 20 to 30 Africans would influence almost everything that would follow after. I think it is foundational. It is as foundational to who we became as a country as our decision in 1776 to break off from the British.
You say Black Americans are the most American of all and are true founding fathers. Can you walk us through from that first ship to today, how we're still seeing the signs?
Yeah, so when you think about the fact that when Thomas Jefferson is writing the Declaration and laying out these words for liberation, that all men are created equal
Yes.
and born with inalienable rights, and while he's writing that, he owns 130 human beings who are in absolute bondage, and in fact, his brother-in-law is sitting there with him, enslaved, to help keep him comfortable. What that means is those ideals were not true when they were written, but Black Americans took those ideas literally, and Black Americans have really fought. You can look at what happens after Reconstruction. You can look at the abolitionist movement. You can look at the civil rights movement. Black people have fought to make those ideals real.
Perfecting democracy.
Absolutely.
I can just say this. I was so embarrassed as a person of color that I had never heard of 1619 until I read your essay, page 16, when you first talk about it. And I just thought, how do we not know this? And I'm not the only one. There was only one person in the room, Betty over there, who went to Harvard. She knew about you, and she knew all about this project and knew all about this date. But you said it's time to stop hiding from our sins and confront the truth. What do you mean?
What I mean is,
And how do we not know about this, Nicole?
we don't know about 1619 the same way that we don't learn very much about slavery. It is shameful. No one wants to talk about their sins or the worst moments. And slavery gives contradiction to our entire creation story of the United States. And so we've tried to push it aside. We've tried to make it marginal. And in doing that, we've marginalized the 40 million descendants of the enslaved as well. So what we're trying to do with this project is force us to confront the truth. And then maybe we can actually start to move past slavery and become the country that was written in our ideals in the Constitution and the Declaration.
It's an effort to reframe American history, but some critics have said it's an effort to delegitimize American history. From the Cato Institute, Illa Shapiro tweeted, it's a project intended to delegitimize mankind's grandest experiment in human liberty. Is it divisive in that way?
I mean, what's amazing about that is people are not arguing the facts. So what they're basically arguing is that we should only talk about certain facts. We should talk about the good part of Thomas Jefferson, but not about the fact that he was an enslaver. I'm saying that history is history, and we have to tell the truth. No, it's not delegitimizing, because the whole point of the article is that Black Americans have used those founding words to actually bring us closer to the democracy that the founders envisioned. And that is the most patriotic of things.
Sorry, you can take us. The thing that's so amazing about this, that makes me so proud, you can look at anything that's happening, just about anything that's happening in the world today and tied to slavery. You look at the highways in Atlanta, you look at the naming of Wall Street, you look at sugar that we eat. But the thing that stuck out to me was healthcare. that you can tie healthcare to slavery. How?
Absolutely. So there's a piece in there about why we're the only Western industrialized country that doesn't have universal health care. And it starts with opposition to universal health care that occurs right after slavery when the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to offer free health care to the formerly enslaved. And there was white opposition to that. And so even today, you see with polling that white Americans will reject social programs if they think large numbers of Black people will benefit from them. And so the harms of slavery have not been contained because there are millions of white Americans, there are millions of Latinos and Asian and Black Americans who don't have health care, who can't get insurance because of slavery.
You say don't look at Black people as a problem, look at Black people as the solution.
Yes, from the beginning, there have been thousands of pages dedicated to saying that Black people are, as Abraham Lincoln said, a troublesome presence in our democracy. But really, what we're arguing with this project is Black Americans have been the perfecters of this democracy, and that if we ever got to the point we would stop seeing us as a problem, we would actually be more of the America that we want to be.
Nicole, I stepped briefly on your line earlier. You see this as a patriotic act?
Yes, of course it is. This isn't saying that this is a country that needs to be destroyed. This is not saying that this is a country that's illegitimate. It's saying that this was a country founded on ideals that were not true at the time, but that Black Americans believed in those ideals and have worked to make those ideals true for all groups. I don't see what is more patriotic than that.
All right. So I want to just to read a little bit. So this is Nicole Hannah Jones again. She's talking about, this is from an interview. She was talking about reframing slavery and Black secession. So I want to read these three paragraphs. The way that we are taught about slavery is that it was a marginal institution, that it was largely an issue amongst Black backward Southerners, and that it had very little impact on other aspects of society. And that the way that things we see in our society now have little to do with slavery and the anti-Black racism that around it. That's just not true. And the reason why we have tried to marginalize slavery is because it is very uncomfortable, because it reveals that these lofty ideas on which our country was founded were actually not true at the time, and that it took a very long time for them to even begin to be true, and that Black people have had to fight to make them be true. We want to believe a certain thing about ourselves. We have a national memory, and that national memory is that we have an exceptional nation built on individual rights and men to speak about the truth, which is that the men who are writing these words own other human beings and deprive 1/5 of the population of all rights and all liberties. It's just a very inconvenient truth to our national narrative. It actually proved that the national narrative is a lie, and so we just don't deal with it. Think about how we are taught about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. If we mention at all that they were enslavers, is as an aside or not central, but the truth is 10 of the first 12 presidents were enslavers, and that it is insignificant. That matters. That is not incidental. The reason that our founding fathers even had the wealth and privilege and stature to believe that they could break off from the most powerful empire in the world at the time was because of profits that they were getting from forced labor and enslaved people. So I think we just cannot deal with the inherent hypocrisy of our founding. It goes against every myth we want to believe about ourselves. We don't want to acknowledge that we were just one of the many slaveocracies that existed in the New World, and that we had those lofty ideas that the founding fathers fully did not intend to be for a large segment of our population. And then I want to read, so this is from the first intro article, Nicole Hannah Jones and the 1619 Project. It's a long article, but it's definitely worth, it's about a 20-minute read, but it's definitely worth reading the whole thing. But I just pulled out these 4 paragraphs I want to read really quickly. And the name, I think it's essential. And our democracy's founded ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true. So she starts out saying they, enslaved Black people, grew and picked a cotton that at the height of slavery was the nation's most valuable commodity, accounting for half of all American exports and 66% of the world's supply. They built the plantations George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, sprawling properties that today attract thousands of visitors from across the globe, captivated by the history of the world's greatest democracy. They laid the foundations of the White House and the Capitol, even placing with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome. They lugged the heavy wooden tracks of the railroads that crisscrossed the South, and that helped take the cotton they picked to the northern textile mills. Fueling the Industrial Revolution, they built vast fortunes for white people north and south. At one time, the second richest man in the nation was a Rhode Island slave trader. Profits from Black people's stolen labor helped that young nation pay off its war debts and finance some of the most prestigious universities It was relentless buying, selling, insuring, financing of their bodies and the products of their labor that made Wall Street a thriving banking, insurance, and trading sector, and New York the financial capital of the world. The United States is a nation founded on both an idea and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, approved on the July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. But white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for hundreds of thousands of Black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. Yet, despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believed fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of Black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideas. And not only for ourselves, Black rights struggles paved the way for every other rights struggles, including women's and gay rights, immigrant and disability rights. Without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different and not be democracy at all. At the time, 1/5 of the population within the 13 colonies struggled under a brutal system of slavery, unlike anything that had existed in the world before. Chattel slavery was not traditional but racial. It was inheritable and permanent, not temporary, meaning generations of Black people were born into and passed their enslaved status onto their children. Enslaved people were not recognized as human beings, but as property that could be mortgaged, tracked, traded, bought, sold, used as collateral, given as a gift, and disposed of violently. Jefferson's fellow white colonialists knew that Black people were human beings, but they created a network of laws and customs astounding for both their precision and cruelty that ensured that enslaved Black people would never be treated as such. And then the last article I'm going to say is Adam Sewer wrote this article about the criticisms that were coming from 1619 from these white institutional, academics. So he wrote, a dispute between the small group of scholars and authors in New York Times Magazine issues on slavery represent a fundamental disagreement over trajectory of American society. U.S. history is often taught and properly understood through the eyes of its great men, who are seen as either heroic or tragic figures in the global struggle for human freedom. The 1619 Project, named for the date of the first arrival of Africans on American soil, sought to place the consequences of slavery and contributions of Black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. Viewed from the perspective of those historically denied the rights and enumerated in American founding documents, the story of country's great men necessarily looked very different. The clash between the Times authors and their historian critiques represent a fundamental disagreement over the trajectory of American society. Was America founded as a slaveocracy, and our current racial inequities a natural outgrowth of that? Or was America conceived in liberty, a nation halting, redeeming itself through its founding principles? Rooted in a vision of American history as a slow, uncertain march toward a more perfect union. The 1619 Project and Hannah Nicole Jones' introductory essay in particular offer a dark vision of the nation in which Americans have made less progress than they think, and which Black people continue to struggle indefinitely for rights they may never fully realize. Inherent in the vision is a kind of pessimism, not about Black struggle, but about the sincerity and viability of white anti-racism. The biggest obstacle to teaching slavery effectively in America is a deep, abiding American need to conceive of and understand our history as progress, as a story of people in a nation that always sought the improvement of mankind, the advancement of liberty and justice, the broadening of pursuits of happiness for all. Newt Gingrich called the 1619 Project a lie, arguing that there were 700,000 white Americans who died in the Civil War in order to free the slaves. In City Journal, the historian Alan Wilzo dismissed the Time Magazine Project as conspiracy theory developed from the chair of ultimate cultural privilege in America, because it notes that human society has enslaved people suddenly found itself vaulted into positions of such privilege, and with the consent, even the appropriation of those who were once enslavers. These are objections not to misstatements of historical fact, but an argument that anti-Black racism is a more tractable problem than most Americans are willing to admit. A major theme of the 1619 Project is that the progress that has been made has been fragile and reversible, and has been achieved in spite of a nation's true founding principles, which are not lofty ideas few Americans generally believe in, but our chances are, or what you think of a 1619 Project depends on whether you believe someone might reasonably come to such a despairing conclusion, whether you agree with it or not. So I just want to say, like, a lot of this, so the things that they talked about in 1619 Project, I mean, no one's arguing the historical facts of it. It's people like Newt Gingrich and Alan Guezzo who are arguing that um, basically black people should be more appreciative, because several 100,000 white Americans died in the Civil War to free slaves. Or that, black people are never in the world, black people have gained such privilege out of, from being enslaved. But in reality, I mean, these are continuing these narratives, whitewash narrative that, after black people were freed, that they all of a sudden became positions of privilege, which is about as far from accuracy as possible. But so the idea is it's not about whether these historical facts are wrong or not. It's about the interpretation. So this is what the arguments around 1619 Project is what do these historic facts mean? Do they mean that black people created this country, or they should be appreciative of all the things white people gave them? I know that's extreme, but I mean, that's essentially what Nick Gingrich is arguing. But so that's just something to think about when if you see criticism, and to understand that, it's more of a perception rather than the actual historical fact. Anyway, all right, I want to move on to the next part, decolonization. So we talked a little bit about decolonization. We actually talked a lot about it during the colonialism class, but just give you a quick idea of what decolonization is. A couple of definitions I want to talk about. Decolonization means by which colonial powers, both structural and cultural, are dismantled by supporting self-determination or the act of freely creating your own future. Decolonization refers to the process of deconstructing colonial ideologies of superiority and privilege of Western thought approaches. On one hand, decolonization involves dismantling structures that perpetuate the status quo, problematizing dominant discourses and addressing unbalanced power dynamics. On the other hand, decolonization involves valuing and revitalization of indigenous knowledge and approaches and weeding out settler biases or assumptions that impact indigenous ways. So decolonization, Daniela writes, decolonization means a total paradigm shift throughout the political, social, cultural, and quite importantly, our educational norms. And then Wikipedia it gives a simple the undoing of colonialism. So there's a lot to decolonization, because colonization really, colonization really set up a lot of oppressive systems, from capitalism to race and indigenous history to enslaving people to whitewashing history to building white supremacy institutions to like all patriarchy and all these different things. So decolonization is kind of like, well, how do we undo a lot of this? Because even though a lot of nations gain their freedom from Europe, they never really figured out how to dismantle these systems. And in many ways, these systems are still operating to this day. So a lot of this, some of the first steps of decolonization is just actually understanding the real history of our country and understanding the real history of indigenous people and enslaved people and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of steps around decolonization, but decolonization can mean a variety of different things, from moving away from this Eurocentric history as whitewash history and actually teaching real perspectives, teaching everyone's perspectives, being as inclusive as possible, teaching indigenous perspectives and black perspectives, teaching about anti-blackness and anti-indigenous institutions in this country. It's about dismantling these systems that maintain these unfair balance structures, whether that's police, whether that's capitalism, patriarchy, voter suppression. It's about economic justice, like reparations, particularly land reparations. It's about giving land back to indigenous people. It's about helping heal the racial wealth gaps and things like that. It's about supporting self-determination and sovereignty. It's about giving power and sovereignty to Black, indigenous people of color, and allowing creating institutions that actually incorporate their culture instead of dominating their culture from a Eurocentric standpoint. It's about creating spaces and being inclusive, respectful. It's about understanding stereotypes and confronting, stereotype, colonial internalizations and stereotypes, such as like the Black criminal or the uncivilized Native or an inferior Black Indigenous person of color, or this white supremacy racial hierarchy. So it's about understanding these concepts of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous. So it's a big thing, but what I like about it is it's not just like dealing with these it's not just breaking off all these different institutions of oppression into their own things. It's about understanding how all of it relates to itself and how we need to undo all of it, or work on that, which can seem daunting, but really, I mean, the first start is just kind of undoing, stopping, undoing the whitewashing of our history. I mean, that's just a first good place to start, is actually understanding our actual history. And that's where I want to get to decolonize this, or decolonize the place. Did this great, they're doing this campaign with Brooklyn Museum right now. So I'm just going to play this to kind of give you a little bit more about what this organization is working, and also understand this is just one of many organizations working on decolonization in this country right now.
You may have heard about the recent controversial hiring of a white woman as the curator of the African art collection at the Brooklyn Museum. Many pointed to the problems of diversity within the museum, but what you probably haven't heard about is the call for the Brooklyn Museum to form a decolonization commission. Remember that museum scene in Black Panther? Killmonger's confronted by a British curator who white-splains the history of an African object that he is looking at. He promptly corrects her by claiming it's actually from the nation of Wakanda, adding,
"How do you think your ancestors got these? You think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else?"
Well, that scene in Black Panther recently hit a lot closer to home since the film came out. In an open letter, we addressed the hire as just a symptom of a larger structural problem and propose a decolonization commission as an opportunity to the curatorial crisis. The aim of the letter was to redress the ongoing legacies of oppression in which the museum is complicit. The call for decolonization comes from about 20 groups in the city, among which are Decolonize This Place, American Indian Community House, Brooklyn Anti-Gentrification Network, Movement to Protect the People, and NYC Stands with Standing Rock. So what can a decolonization commission look like? We will have to start from the land that the museum sits on, a territorial acknowledgement that the museum is on the territory of the Lenni Lenape. The Brooklyn Museum holds over 6,000 African artifacts, making it the largest collection of African art in the United States. And while historians are often able to date the objects to very specific times and locations, information about how these objects ended up in the museum is often obscure. So we call for an inventory of all colonial era objects of both African and indigenous people with the goal of reparations and repatriation. Additionally, we call for an upgrade of working conditions and pay for ground staff, including security, food service, and janitorial divisions, who are largely people of color. The Brooklyn Museum has done some amazing shows like We Wanted a Revolution, Black Radical Women, and the current show, Radical Women, Latin American Art. But at the same time, the museum plays the huge role in the gentrification of the neighborhood. So we ask, does it just want the art and not the people? The Brooklyn Museum is by no means alone. The American Museum of Natural History literally has these skulls of African people in their collection. And the Smithsonian owns the remains of the bodies of massacred indigenous people. Yet rarely are the histories of slavery and genocide acknowledged in these museums. To be clear, this call to action was never an attack or campaign against the newly appointed white curator of African art, Kristen Windmuller Luna. She may very well be a highly qualified candidate, but her hiring highlights several systemic issues latent in the art world itself. Only 4% of art curators, conservators, educators, and senior museum staff in the US are African American. Surrounding these conversations around diversity in the arts is a long-standing call for people of color to be able to control their own narratives. But let's be honest. The idea of repatriation is fundamentally against the interest of museums and their board members. There's a not so accidental link between the history of stolen indigenous artifacts and the damage to communities of color through the gentrification practices those same museums and institutions uphold. And that sentiment begs another question. Who are these museums for? Are they for the surrounding communities that their board members, including real estate tycoon David Berliner, are strategically pushing out? Are they even for the people whose cultures have been systemically stolen from them? As Audre Lorde puts it, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. With the call for a decolonization commission, Decolonize This Place is calling for a radical examination of the foundation and structure of the institution. Radical as in going down to the roots of the United States as a settler colony. The theft of land, labor, and culture over 4 centuries that continues to play out today as gentrification displaces and dispossesses people of color at the doorstep of the museum itself. Will the museum listen to the communities it claims to serve, or will it continue business as usual? Summed up in the banners dropped at last week's action, they want the art, but not the people.
All right. So the last part, I'm going to show, I believe, last 2 videos, just to give them a little bit more context of some of the work that the Equal Justice Initiative is working on. And this one's focuses on the museum that they built in Montgomery, Alabama.
The American South. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We've actually littered the landscape with the iconography of the Confederacy, which we romanticize, we honor. And I think that has left us vulnerable to replicating those features of white supremacy that we've actually never repudiated. This is the entrance of the Legacy Museum from Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. And we have this icon to just talk about this uniquely American challenge of being a nation that's recovering from the legacy of slavery and also being the nation with the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Montgomery, a city shaped by slavery, because in fact, that is the history of this community.
All right. And then the last thing, I'm gonna just leave you with this last poem. Sybil Dunnigan wrote this amazing poem about the National Memorial for Peace and Justice Museum, and it talks about the importance of bringing this history to light.
Freed from the attics of your history, you will find me at this memorial for peace and justice. Once shrouded in the shadows of shame and bigotry, I'm now drenched in the truth of sunlight, but will you hear me? Near a river that once shipped men and women in bondage, you'll see how hate first shackled and chained me and dragged my ancestry across the sea. Agony washed across my face as humanity, stolen from our land, was snatched from our arms. I became a commodity to the economy, 3/5 of a person. Even I condone me. Although I was emancipated, the violence reincarnated into this hunger of racial terrorism. It imprisoned all of those who looked like me with fear. The victims' names are inscribed in 800 columns. Written across these walls are their stories about how they made caricatures of our character based on our skin color. When we said we were innocent, they called us criminals. 2 Black teens accused by a white girl of being threatening were lynched together. When we voiced injustices, they strung us high to die. A wife was hanged with her unborn child for questioning her husband's hanging. I am those teens. That family is me too, and we are more than 4,400 lives who are lynched, shot, and burned alive. But due to your silence, the violence didn't die, it evolved. We were dehumanized by Jim Crow laws and policies, but we marched against the calls of white supremacy because we heard our calls to press on against injustice and to honor our bodies. My history is your history. My blood fed this soil. 6-foot-long monuments as bronze as my skin lay on the ground waiting to be claimed by the counties where these atrocities occurred. The rough surfaces are engraved with the names of those victimized in the violence we have not recognized until now. I know I am hard to listen to, but we cannot heal as a country if we don't recognize the wound. Otherwise, we will continue down this road of demise, and the violence will continue to thrive in the silence.